This video is a little strange, but I thought you might find the things here interesting. I'm not going to claim these are spooky ghosts or anything, but these are pretty much things I either perceived to be creepier than they were at the time because I was younger, or stuff I'm chalking up to being dreams or whatever it is. So you can make of each of these what you will, but these are my personal experiences I've just made into a script when I was thinking about them the other day. I'm not embellishing them in any way either, I've just written them up in a more clear format and put some spooky music in the background because I thought that might be entertaining for you to listen to. And I haven't posted these anywhere else in written format, this is just something that I have. I might, but I don't know. If this sounds interesting to you, then let me know what you think. Dream about a hallway. So I used to stay nights at my grandma's house a lot. They were close by and oftentimes my cousin would stay there too and we'd just have a fun sleepover or something. The rest of it was fine and I don't have any creepy stories from anything other than this. And maybe a few if I remember them, but it was a nice place all around. Everything was pretty well lit and even at night nothing took on a tone that was out of the ordinary. It was just the usual sort of dark hallway sort of thing that kids are still kind of creeped out about. There was this long L-shaped hallway that had all of the bedrooms along it and there was a bathroom at one end of the L. In the longer section of the L, it went off into a little sort of room and that's where the front door was at the end of that. And in that room there was also a stairwell opposite the front door that led down to the bottom floor. See, this house was on a sort of hill, if you will, so that top floor where we were staying at was where my grandma's house mainly was, and you'd have stairs along the top of the hill to get to that part. The bottom part was much smaller and it was mainly a place that they either used for people to stay in or they just rented it out. The stairwell looked like a typical basement style one and it was locked because the bottom area was being rented out at one point, but there was also a time when it was completely empty. Keep that in mind, and keep in mind that it was empty when I was staying on the night that the story takes place, I'm pretty sure. Anyways, I was around 7 or 8, I think, when I was staying over. I don't think my cousin was over at the time because I think I would have woken him up and told him about this after I experienced it if he was. I was sleeping, and I had gotten up to go to the bathroom during the night. The bathroom that's right at the end of the L shape. And so you can imagine I was always a little creeped out when I was walking along that section at night. I was always especially creeped out when walking past the archway that led to the kitchen area. There was this solid darkness there, apart from the small lights of the appliances on standby and stuff like that. I got back to bed after coming back from the bathroom and fell asleep pretty fast. Then I had a dream. This is one of, if not the creepiest dream I've ever had, and I still remember it just as vividly to this day. It started out with me going to the bathroom again. It was kind of a repeat of what just happened, where I woke up and went out into the hallway as normal. The first thing I noticed out of the ordinary was that none of the little lights were on in the kitchen. When I passed the archway into the kitchen, it was solid blackness, and it no longer had anything else in it. I shrugged at first, thinking it was just some of the family members getting up to switch everything off for whatever reason, and I kept walking. I thought that everything was colder than it usually was, and much more still. I mean, I didn't even really hear the cars or anything going past like I usually could, like the air itself just kind of stopped. I went into the bathroom and the second thing I noticed was that the window in the bathroom was now solid black too. I remember you could usually see at least a small amount of light from the street lamp down the road, and if you craned your head to the side, you could see the street lamp and you could see the part of the road as well. If you had the bathroom light off especially, of course. But this time there was nothing there. It was as though there was a complete absence of light in its entirety from outside, or there was some sort of material pressed against the window and it prevented you from seeing anything. Regardless, I didn't seem to care too much. I mean, nighttime wasn't the best time to see things, right? So I go to leave the bathroom and go back to bed. This is where the dream gets a little more intense. The hallway, when I opened the door, was not the hallway of the house. This one was kind of old and flaked, and it split off into some intersections and tunnels further out. It was dark, but for some reason I could almost see everything in a sort of grainy green. It was like I was looking into the world with a tiny bit of a night vision thing going on. The hallway looked as though it was made out of some sort of old wood. The hallway itself was normal width. from side to side, it didn't seem any narrower, but the ceiling, if there was one, was so high up that I only saw darkness when I looked up. I couldn't really seem to see the end of it, so it must have been really tall. I walked a bit forward because I was more confused and in shock at anything, and then of course I probably didn't realize I was in a dream. And I saw there was a tiny indent in the wall where the archway should be going into the kitchen, but of course there was no archway there. I remember thinking I should just follow the L shape, as I was in the dream state of thinking, and I just wanted to see where it would go anyway. I kept walking for a bit, but very slowly and kind of on and off. I would stop and stand and just listen for a bit to see if there was anything there, and I think the only thing I heard was a tiny bit of a rumbling noise. One thing I remember that I don't think about as much was how smooth the floor was. It just seemed strange though, because the walls were in such a bad state. I hadn't really touched the walls, but if I ran my finger along them I probably would have gotten a lot of splinters or at least dust or something on my fingers. The floor was just really smooth. It almost felt like there wasn't really anything there. It's a minor detail, but there you go. I walked along more until I got to the bend of the L shape and I saw the stairwell. The one I mentioned earlier that should have been back down the hall where the front door was. What was it doing there? This was where the living room was supposed to be, and there was now an empty space with the stairwell. Not only that, but the stairwell wasn't actually blocked off anymore, and where the room should have ended now just kind of extended forward for I don't really know how long because it was too dark to see. The door in the stairwell was now clear and it was opening. For the first time in the dream I had this sort of feeling that something was going to happen. I don't know if it was that I was going to die, but I just felt like I didn't want to be there. It was sort of this immense fear, and it suddenly just seemed to happen. Like I wasn't feeling anything before, and then I just suddenly was. And with that, I turned and quickly went back down the hallway, turning to the light from the bathroom door, which I hadn't actually closed, and I was really grateful that I hadn't, because it was one of the only things that was guiding me towards it. I didn't know what was going on, and I didn't know what was behind the door and the stairwell, but for some reason I had this feeling that if I had stuck around to find out, I would never come back. I had turned my back to that stairwell and started going quickly away, but I could see that that door wasn't exactly opening quickly. It was sort of just very slowly moving forward, and I couldn't see if anything was pushing it because I couldn't see what was inside. Just as I got to the bathroom door and closed it, I remember having this now or never sort of feeling. Like, if I didn't get the door closed now, everything was doomed. Because the thing in the stairwell would just come out. As soon as I closed the bathroom door, the light went off. And after a little while, I started to see the usual light that I would see from the window, from the street lamp. Also, the air felt more normal, I guess. I can't really describe it, but anyways, I stayed there for about 10 minutes before actually cracking open the door again. I even checked for the small lights in the kitchen from the microwave when I eventually walked back. I think I woke up after seeing that because I just remember waking up in bed next. I don't actually remember getting back into bed, but dreams work weirdly. And everything was fine after that. I mean, I felt weird, but other than that, the things around me seemed just fine. As for the way I felt, I was freaked out, but there was something else as well. I felt a little displaced. You know that feeling when you come back after a really long trip and you haven't been home in a long time, and when you finally open the door to your own house, there's that initial kind of displaced feeling that you get when you have to get used to the routine of your own house, the smells of your own house. Maybe your house is a bit colder than outside because you haven't opened the door in a while and the curtains have been closed. Just stuff like that kind of hits you. I was getting that feeling for some reason, even though I never left the house, and even though I know that's a feeling of a dream, and since it's a really vivid dream, and I remember it being one of the most vivid dreams I'd had, probably the first vivid dream I've ever had at that age, it's understandable, but it was just kind of weird to me at the time, so it stuck with me. The feeling faded around midday, and afterwards I was just fine, but again, that was just a weird thing to note. Another thing about the stairwell is, even though I never really cared about it too much, sometimes I was a bit fascinated by it. Because it was always super quiet down there, and there were tenants downstairs who were staying there when it was being rented out. You could sometimes hear down there when you went to other places in the house, but it always seemed a bit off to me how even if you could hear them in other places, when you went to that door, you couldn't hear them for some reason. Like, I remember one time they were having this party, and it wasn't really that loud, but you could sort of hear the music coming from the floor. And I went over to the door, and theoretically I should be able to hear them, but for some reason I just heard silence. Another thing to note about that is that I don't really remember exactly how the house was shaped at the bottom, so the door was probably just a long way away from the hallway, but at the time it was creepy. As I said before, this is the kind of video that this is. The crying girl. Okay, this one sounds a bit cliche, but you'll understand why I'm putting it here. Again, it's just something that I remember for some reason. Now, despite the vividness of the first story that I told you, not all of the details are as clear in this one. This one, even though I can tell you the details of what happened really well, does sort of have that wishy-washy quality to it that dreams have. Like there's a filter over it, if you will. Now, the weird thing about this one is that I am obviously sure this is a dream, which will seem obvious as I tell the story, but for some reason, my mind has pretty much always registered this as an actual memory of something that happened to me, which is understandable when kids have vivid imaginations, but it still feels weird. I think that at the time that I had this dream, I must have been confused and thought it was an actual memory, and it kind of just stuck with me. I'd have to say I was about 5 or 6 here. I can tell because I moved around a lot as a kid, which means a lot of the time a new school, and when my memories are a tiny bit foggy and I can't really place when they were, I use the school that I remember being in at the time as a way to kind of gauge how old I was. In this instance, I was out in the playground with some other kids from my year, and I forgot what we were doing exactly, but I just remember kind of walking around. This is why I think it was a dream, if you really have to question it, because I'm just kind of drifting around in this memory. Anyways, I saw this girl ahead of me. I hadn't seen her before, so I thought she might be new because I would have recognized her otherwise. We were all sort of spread out in the sort of quad area of the school, but we were all still pretty close together, so it was kind of crowded. The girl was crying, and I couldn't hear the sound of her crying even though she seemed to be crying quite intensely. She seemed to be making that face that would have made her crying loud, you know, when someone's kind of hiccuping and they look like they're starting to hyperventilate, and it just seems different than someone who's trying not to make any noise when they're crying. I couldn't even hear her sniffing or anything, and her feet were kind of wobbling around because she wasn't standing steadily because she was very upset. Her shoes had buckles on them too, I remember, and I distinctly remember that because I was just wondering why they didn't make any noise. My shoes also had them, and they were quite loose, so I remember when I used to walk around in them, it used to make a lot of noise, as with everyone else's, but even though hers weren't exactly the same, they still had the same sort of buckle on them, so I would have thought that they would make a noise. The place I was standing wasn't exactly that loud, but it still had a bit of noise with all of these kids talking and laughing. Plus, I think that there was another class in another part of the school a bit of the way up because I heard noises from there as well, but I would have thought I would have at least heard something from her, but I didn't. At the time I didn't think about this too much and went to get the teacher, because I just registered that there was an upset child and I wanted to go see if I could help. And this required me to turn my back to her. So I went off and got the teacher, and one thing that struck me as odd as well is the fact that I seemed to be the only one who cared about getting any help for this girl when she was so obviously really distressed, and it was kind of alarming. There were lots of kids in my class who would immediately go and help someone if they were crying or something like that, so it was kind of weird that they weren't doing it first. The teacher wasn't that far away, so she would have noticed too, but again, the kid wasn't making any noise. Either way, I went and got the teacher to come with me, saying that there was a girl crying and I didn't know why. The teacher followed, but when we got there, the girl was gone. Completely gone. The space she was occupying didn't even look empty, she was just completely gone, and I think it was just filled with some other kids that had drifted over to that spot, and I don't know how that happened or why. I have no idea what happened there. No one was acknowledging that she was gone or was even there in the first place. I didn't even know when she disappeared exactly. She could have disappeared when I immediately turned around, or she could have disappeared while I was talking to the teacher. She wasn't making any noise, so I have absolutely no idea. Now, I was expecting the teacher to tell me to stop messing around or something because I just got her to come over saying there was someone crying and there wasn't anyone there. But she seemed to just be standing there minding her own business as if she always was, and she even asked me if I wanted something when she noticed I was standing next to her. She was as friendly as usual, and I was confused because it seemed like she didn't even remember me asking her about what happened moments ago. I walked away and went back to do something else, and this is when the memory ends. So I think I woke up here because it sort of trails off. That's really it. I never really got a satisfying end to that one. A video game scare. So this is a really dumb one, and the rest of them are essentially just dreams. so I want to quickly give you a little bit of variety and talk about something really quickly. So again, this is something that happened when I was around 5. My parents had gotten me one of those shovelware games. I kind of remember it vaguely looking like Open Season, and I know that that was a shovelware title at the time when the movie came out, but I don't know if it was that one exactly. I didn't really know anything about shovelware at the time or anything like that, so I was just happy to get a game and I immediately started playing it. I don't even remember that much about the game, so I don't really know if it was bad or I don't know if anything else happened. I know at some point in the game I was wandering around in the woods at night, and it must have been more an intense part of the game because there were some flashes of things every now and again. It kind of looked in that way that shovelware does, where instead of actually making an explosion, it just kind of flashes the screen white and slows everything down for a bit before fading back to normal, while there's this sort of JPEG blob of fire what the explosion is. I don't know. At least I think that was what's happening. I don't know, the game was just kind of broken at that point. I don't think the game ran very well, it looked very broken. During one of these flashes, it was kind of partially fading out when the game began to freeze. There was a sort of low-pitched hum and this grating noise. The game just kind of stayed like that. Because of the faded look, some of the characters were kind of visible and some of the other characters weren't visible. The background wasn't really visible at all. Everything on the screen was all silhouettes, and the way they were arranged made the characters and the things on the landscape look like ominous faces just kind of staring at me. They looked all warped too. It was the whole generic scary story about a haunted gaming. All it needed was hyper-realistic blood if you thought about it. But that's what happened. I sat there for a while just kind of being freaked out by this sudden unchanging thing on the screen. Then there was this loud noise, before I straight up unplugged it and didn't touch the thing for a while. I don't think I played the game much afterwards when I eventually picked it up again. This isn't really anything special, but I thought I'd say it because a lot of these sorts of videos usually go over the top with some sort of paranormal edge to the story, and most of the creepy stuff we go through is kind of like this. I really love listening to everything else as well, but I thought I'd just contribute something that wasn't something I'd heard a million times. The potato figure. This one has a really stupid name. I'm calling it that because that's just what it is. This one is kind of half a dream and half just overactive imagination because this is pretty much self-explanatory as the story goes along. Especially since all the ones I've told so far were from when I was around 5 or whatever. This one is from when I was 3, I'm pretty sure, because of the house I lived in. I know it sounds weird for me to remember all these things, but they did frighten me or stick with me a lot, so that's why. At the time I used to play this game with my mom where one of us would sit on the carpet in the living room with our eyes closed, and the other one would move around the space with a tambourine and shake it at certain points. It was the sort of rhythm game where the one who's sitting down would try to point to where they think the sound is coming from even though they can't see it, and the game would go on like that. It was kind of about teaching you about spatial awareness and stuff like that. There were times I remember playing this game with something else. I was in the living room at certain times and I remember sitting down and playing a different version of the game. And participating in this different version of the game is this sort of very, very tall, blurry figure that had to stoop because of the ceiling. It was mostly just kind of a blur of, it was mostly a dark blur except for the face. The head was a blur of different skin tones all twirled together like paint, but I couldn't actually see any features, and everything had this sort of hazy quality to it that I'm not sure was there at the time that I imagined it or if it was just there in my memory now. I started calling it a potato because I for some reason thought it was funny to call everything a potato at the time. This figure was always at a distance, of course, and it made no noise. It only seemed to be in the house. And by that I mean it only seemed to be in that particular house. When my family moved out of that house, I never saw it again, so I think what made me imagine that figure was one of the trees that was in the yard, because I remember it having a sort of stoop like that as well. So that's probably why I stopped imagining it afterwards. Well, the type of game that I played with it, since there was no noise, involved me closing my eyes, as per usual, but this time I would open them and after I pointed to see where the figure was. Because when I closed my eyes, it would move across the room at some point, and when I opened it, it would be in a different position. I don't have a lot of experiences with this that aren't just repetitive, like what I've just told you, and I don't have a lot to say because nothing really happened. There weren't really any other weird things in that house from what I remember either, it was just a normal house. Then again, at the time, maybe some weird things must have happened and I just thought of it as normal. But I'm probably going to remember more stuff after I make this video because of the memories that are coming up. So this is the one that happened when I was 11, and the other one happened some years later. One of them has a sort of weird thing to it like all the other ones, but the last one is just plain old dream. I don't have another thing to add to it. So the first one was when I was 11, and it involved the house that I lived in, but the layout of the house is not important here. The dream had a sudden sort of start, with me just suddenly in a bright room that I didn't recognize. I don't remember much about it, it just looked like an ordinary sort of living room you'd see in furniture catalogs, but much, much smaller. Everything was kind of bunched together because of how small the room was, and it was way too bright in there. I started walking towards the door, but it was one of those weird things where the more you run towards it, the more it seems to move away. But for some reason, despite this, I got to the door fairly quickly. But there was this feeling that I was sort of running out of time. And when I finally got to the door and opened it, the house looked completely abandoned, and there was this sort of dark blue fog over everything that I can't really quite identify or describe properly. It was like it was perpetually just before nighttime. Just before all the light goes away, but it never really moved to that point. The house was crumbling, and it looked like no one had lived there in 100 years or so, possibly more actually. The feeling that I was too late is what came after the feeling of running out of time as soon as I saw this, and I guess I was late by a lot of time. I stood there for a while just kind of looking at the house, and it started to shake. It shook, and I didn't bother moving from where I was for some reason, even though I really wanted to move away. I just kept standing there, the house was shaking, and it stopped after a while. As it stopped, it kind of just started to pulse, almost as though it was breathing. Then I just seemed to completely give up and move to the wall. By give up, I mean after running out of time, everything in my mind just kind of went, what's the point? And I had moved to the wall to try and get back into that room that I was in, but the room wasn't there anymore. The wall itself had changed, and as everything was pulsing, it looked kind of wet almost, like it was alive. The wallpaper looked kind of sticky, and there seemed to be something underneath it. I don't know why, but I reached forward, and the wall almost reached out to me and kind of pulled me in before I woke up. This one is kind of freaky because when I woke up, I had one of those sort of auditory hallucinations that some people have before they fully wake. Especially if you have stuff like sleep paralysis and things like that, where you feel like you are awake and you feel like it was real and it really happened to you as you're kind of pulled from that state. So for this one in particular, there was this voice that was really deep and raspy, and it sounded like it was next to my ear, and it said the word when before I woke up. I'm pretty sure it was the word when, it sounded very clear. And it was just as I was pulling myself out of that dream state as well, so I at first believed that it was really happening before I realized that it was just one of those auditory things, because at the time I had a conversation with my mom about one of those because I'd had one of those before, so luckily I wasn't too freaked out. But I was still freaked out enough that it was around, I think, somewhere around 6 in the morning. It was pretty early, so I had had enough light to start reading a book and just sort of sit in my bed reading and calming myself down before getting up normally with the rest of my family who woke up later. I just didn't want to go back to bed. This dream was very vivid, and it's still something that sticks with me and influences a lot of the horror stuff that I write today. And it just kind of goes to show you as well that even if you can rationally break down every single part of the dream or experience that you've had, it still kind of creeps you out in some way. So the last dream is just kind of an ordinary one and a lot more mundane but still creepy. I was sketching something, a face, or it was a portrait I think. I'd drawn all the features, but I think I forgot to shade it. And I think this was about 3 years later as well. Nothing about it looked creepy though, it just looked like a normal drawing. I put it down on my desk and closed my book, putting my pencils away. I had this box at the time that I still have today where it has these different compartments where you can put the pencils in and put the brushes in one section and everything like that, and then you close it with a clasp. I put the box with my pencils and everything in on top of the book that I just closed, and I left that on my desk when I went to bed. In my dream, I think I was sitting in the bed with a different book in my lap and watching the desk for some reason. Sure enough, as dreams work, the sketchbook that I'd placed on the desk started to shake. I heard this sort of gross, kind of squelchy noise coming from it. It was like something was oozing out of it and being crushed by the stuff on top of the notebook. It was like someone's eye was being squashed by something and it was just dripping through the sides. I know that's a gross comparison, but that's really what it was like. All I did was just watch that happen, and I saw the book opening more and more as the box kind of slid off of it. Something was like forming almost. It was kind of oozing out of the book, but as it kept going, it regained more and more of its form and became more solid, so the book would open more and more as it pushed. But thankfully I woke up before I could see what the thing I had drawn had turned into in my dream. That was it. That was the dream. But it was, as the others, enough to stick with me for a while after I woke up, even though nothing about it seemed to really sink into reality when I woke. I can't remember if I finished the drawing, but I never really finished my drawings at all, so there's no special reason for why I wouldn't, having to do with the dream. So that's really it. As I said before, it's nothing really special, but I just figured that I could make it something lightly spooky, just to entertain you for a bit. I'm setting up some criteria for perhaps getting some of your own stories that you could send me and I could read them if you'd like. It's kind of hard finding some good stories to read sometimes, so I figured I might as well just get some memories from people and stuff like that. I wanted to use an email or something, but in the meantime you can just put them in the comments if you'd like. All I would say is just make sure to paragraph it for me so I can read it properly. I'm not sure how often I'd make narration videos now, as I said, because there's not a lot of stories that I really want to do that I can think of off the top of my head, so maybe getting into reading some creepy experiences from you guys might help.